Hello, and welcome to On Moral Injury, a webinar for journalists and students from the Resilience Media Project at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. I'm Dale Willman. The goal of the Resilience Media Project is to help journalists in their coverage of systemic grand challenges, such as pandemics and climate risk. Right now, we do that by giving journalists tools to better cover issues surrounding these topics and to show them how to better envision stories that look towards solutions. But it's also important to discuss more fundamental questions, including how we can stay safe and healthy while we do our jobs. And today we hope to do just that. Now to our program. A sentiment perhaps familiar to many of us was spoken years ago to a Toronto psychiatrist by his new patient, who was a journalist covering conflict. She said, "If I told my boss I was morally distressed, he'd never let me go back into the field." Many of us have had similar thoughts and responses because we've all covered difficult stories, and sometimes have had problems stemming from that coverage. On the local beat, it may be murders or traffic accidents, on the coast a hurricane, or in the west a wildfire. For war correspondents, it's the fighting and the human cost. And for environmental journalists, it might be the continuing collapse of world systems due to climate change. And of course, chance labeling journalists as enemies of the state don't help. Whatever the reason, continued trauma can lead to what a Toronto doctor now calls moral injury, a wound on your soul. Since that first case many years ago, Dr. Anthony Feinstein has continued to work with journalists, and he joins us in conversations today. Dr. Feinstein is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto in Canada. He grew up in Greenside, Johannesburg, and right after he graduated from medical school, he witnessed fighting firsthand in Africa while he spent 2 years in the military. Today, his work focuses on people with multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain disorder, and conversion disorder. Anthony is the author of the book, Shooting War. Also joining us is the author of the article that led to today's discussion. The story on moral injury is in the August issue of Harper's Magazine, and its author is Janine di Giavonni. Janine is a multi-award-winning journalist and author and has covered conflict from Syria and Iraq to Kosovo and Bosnia. She's now a senior fellow and professor at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Now, about today's discussion, we'll begin today talking about moral injury in the context of conflict coverage. Of course, most journalists don't go to war, but it's important to establish a good understanding of the issue. It's also important to understand that any journalist can be affected no matter the coverage you offer, and we'll just expand on the discussion as we move on. So, Anthony, I'd like to start with you. What brought you to this work?
Well, you touched on it in your introduction. The year was 1999, and a patient came to my clinical service. So I'm a psychiatrist, and I have a clinical practice at a hospital. And a patient came to my service who had been referred by my colleagues in neurology. She had an unusual presentation. At first glance, she seemed to have a constellation of neurological symptoms, but they couldn't really find a neurological disorder. They did extensive brain imaging. They worked her up. And at the end of the day, they felt that what she was showing was a very dramatic presentation of psychological distress manifesting as physical symptoms. That's the diagnosis of conversion disorder, which you referred to in the introduction. So she came to my clinic, and she did really well with therapy, and she recovered. And she was a fascinating person. She was a frontline journalist who had been working in Africa, covering the famines in East Africa. She had seen a lot of trauma, huge numbers of people dying, and she'd become progressively distressed by what she'd witnessed. But rather than speak to someone about her emotional distress, she kept it to herself. She basically bottled it and resorted to drinking to try and manage her anxiety. And then on her return to Canada, she had this major breakdown and came into the emergency room of a hospital and ended up getting referred to me. And she was interesting. She had had an interesting life. I enjoyed speaking to her. She did really well with therapy. But then she said to me this, you quoted it already. She told me that she could not let on to her manager or her organization that she had been experiencing emotional distress while out in the field because she was concerned this would put an end to her career as a frontline journalist. And she loved her work. She found great meaning in her work, and the thought of not being able to go out and do this kind of work was devastating to her. So she kept quiet about it. And I was surprised by this. I thought that there would be an understanding attitude to what she was feeling. And so, she kind of piqued my curiosity about journalism and war and conflict and emotions. And I asked my research team that was involved with many multiple sclerosis projects to take a break for an afternoon from what they were doing and just to go away and look at the literature on journalism and war and conflict and tell me what they could find. And at the end of the afternoon, they came back and said, we can't find a single publication on the topic, not one, which was, I didn't believe that, because one generally doesn't arrive in medicine at a new area. I mean, there's always someone who's come before you who's written about something, particularly with respect to trauma. But there literally wasn't a single publication on this topic in the medical literature, which further intrigued me. Why was that? And so I wrote a grant application and I sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. and said, no one's ever looked at the question of war, journalism, and trauma, but I'd like to do this. And it was pre-9/11, and the world was in a more relaxed state, and the economy was booming. And to be honest, it was the easiest grant that I ever got, because I wrote back and said, yeah, great question, and we'll cut you a check. And so I started to do this work. I have to tell you that since then, it's been virtually impossible to get money to do this kind of research. But back in 1999, I got a grant from the Freedom Forum in Washington, and that started this whole project. Then on the basis of that, I went to London and I started to work there. And that's where I met Janine for the first time. That was in early 2000 at the Freedom Forum offices in London. And that started me on this journey of looking at journalists and their emotional health. And the world has kept me busy since then.
So let's talk. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 10 years on PTSD.
Yeah.
Can you describe the two and clearly show a difference between them?
You mean PTSD and moral injury?
Yes.
Yes.
All
okay.
right.
Yeah. So PTSD is a mental illness. Moral injury is not a mental illness. That means that PTSD appears in the American Psychiatric Association, their classification of mental illness. And moral injury is not there. And I hope it never gets there, by the way. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition that can arise when an individual confronts a very severe stress, the kind of event that could have killed them or could have killed other people or did kill other people. So the stress is very high. That's the first point. And then in response to that, the person needs to develop symptoms that fall into four broad categories. The first is re-experiencing the trauma through flashbacks or nightmares or unwanted recollections or memories. Important point here is that this is unwanted. It's involuntary. The person doesn't want this experience. It just intrudes into their consciousness. The second symptom grouping refers to avoidance, that you want to stay away from reminders of your trauma. So you make a conscious effort not to go back to the scene of the trauma, or you want to shut down your troublesome thoughts, or you try and distract yourself from these memories. The third symptom category refers to your body's autonomic nervous system, which becomes hyper-aroused. So you cannot fall asleep, you can't concentrate, you come back to a safe environment, but you're still hyper-vigilant, you still feel you're under threat, and you have a prominent startle response. And then the fourth symptom category refers to a negative belief system. So things that formerly gave you pleasure, you now start looking at with an element of distrust, that you anticipate further misfortune, and you can't enjoy life the way you once did, almost like a depressive quality to one's thoughts. So to have the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have symptoms from all four groups. And the symptoms have to be present for at least a month. Now, moral injury is different. So moral injury refers to the damage done to one's moral conscience or one's moral compass by perpetrating or witnessing or failing to prevent acts that transgress your own moral set of beliefs. And that's very important. So you can develop moral injury from things that you do or from things that you fail to do. In other words, I didn't speak out. I didn't prevent something from happening. And moral injury is associated with emotions, primary emotions such as shame and guilt. It can occur together with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and anxiety, but by itself, it's not a mental illness.
Can someone suffer from both?
Oh, yes, frequently. And one of the dangers of moral injury, that it might be the gateway or the conduit to PTSD or depression. And the presence of prominent PTSD symptoms with moral injury is common in the literature. You often see that. But one can have moral injury without PTSD. And one should not pathologize moral injury as a mental illness, because it's not. It's a reaction to what I've described.
So Janine, let me bring you in if I could. And I assume that your interest in this topic stems in part from your personal experience with the work that you've done over the years.
Okay, hi everyone. So I began working in conflict zones and war zones in the early 1990s. Initially in the West Bank and Gaza, in the occupied territories in Palestine, and then the Bosnian War. And from there, I went to work in Rwanda during the genocide, all over Africa. And basically, the 1990s for war reporters was an incredibly dangerous, difficult, and terrible time. Well, for obviously for the people involved in the conflicts, but as reporters, we were a small tribe, and we basically went from war to war to war. I remained in Bosnia for a long time during the siege of Sarajevo and then the massacre, the genocide at Srebrenica. So I met Anthony in the late 90s, Anthony, it must have been, or early 2000.
Early 2000, yeah.
When he began his study on PTSD and its effect on war reporters. Now, many of us who, especially let's say the siege of Sarajevo or the genocide at Rwanda, witnessed these things. Very, very hard, unless you are, have a kind of steely constitution, to not feel extreme guilt at what happened as a bystander, as a witness, that there was not some way that we could have prevented or even tried to do something to bring the world's attention to these terrible, terrible things that were happening. I went on to report war, continuously. So after the 90s, it was then the 9/11 wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Arab Spring. Most recently, I've been working in Syria since the war started, and also working on very specific projects involving Christian communities in the Middle East that are being eradicated by the Islamic State and other means, including climate change. So in other words, I've witnessed a lot in my career of terrible things I wish I could undo. Or I think Anthony or someone called it unbearable knowledge, the things that we've accumulated, the things that we see, which go against, personally for me, if I'm going to speak personally, my own moral core, and my own compass, which basically, I believe that human beings are good at heart. So how can human beings do these terrible, terrible things to each other? My last book, The Morning They Came for Us, Dispatches from Syria, was largely a book about torture, and about what happened inside Bashar al-Assad's torture chambers, police centers, and kind of inside the minds of people who did these terrible things, and also the victims of it. So when you spend an awful lot of time with victims of torture, who have undergone such horrific things, such darkness, it's impossible that you do not take this onto your own persona. So moral injury is something that really fascinated me. And then I was contacted by Anthony again, because I was one of the participants in his original study on PTSD back in 2000, to participate in a study on moral injury. Another aspect of this was the refugee crisis, the refugee crisis. So many of us who reported that, the vast exodus of people fleeing the Syrian war, but also coming from Africa, deeply troubling to see the distress and the condition they were in, and again, be unable to help them. And Anthony uses this great example of, let's say there's a photographer standing on a beach and they see a boat capsize, or a small float, whatever you call them, capsize, and people are drowning. Do you take photographs? Do you stay on the beach and do your job, which is to document this awful thing? Do you jump in the sea and try to save them? What do you do? And I think Anthony was seeing more and more people, more and more journalists and humanitarian workers who were extremely distressed by this. So it kind of puts a name for me on something. I think I've suffered for 33 decades of working in war zones, and the feeling of being helpless, feeling that we tried to save people, we tried to save countries. I know that sounds very grand, but when you're a war reporter and you're deeply committed to protecting civilians, to witness their immense suffering is gut-wrenching. And I know it's something that's haunted me my entire career.
How does that affect, obviously we want to talk about the effect to you personally, but how does that affect your ability to do your job? What are the ramifications with your work when you're in that constant mode of distress?
Look, many years ago when I went through the process for the study on PTSD, I think I was one of the few people that came out of it not having PTSD. And I remember having this conversation with Anthony where he said, your tribe of war reporters, you guys spend it's the average of 15 years in war zones, whereas the average soldier will do maybe 3 tours. So for us, it's this continuous kind of exposure to violence and suffering on an extreme level, which is why so many of my colleagues kind of had terrible issues with many things: alcoholism, depression, inability to commit. I mean, all the classic symptoms. For me, I have to say, I think I've been fortunate in that I was able to channel my own pain into my writing. So, I write books, which is what I do, and I teach at Yale. And one of the courses I teach at Yale is called 4 Conflicts Through a Human Rights Lens. So I'm basically training a new generation of future humanitarians, lawyers, activists, journalists, by teaching them the lessons of what happened in the 1990s in these wars, and why we should not repeat them, and how we can use these wars as indicators of conflict prevention or conflict resolution. So that's a very long way of saying, I think my work sustains me in a huge way so that I am able, to function. Of course, I suffer, I cry, I feel, when I leave a place, like for instance, I remember during the terrible time in Aleppo before it fell to Assad's forces, when I would leave, it was just a sense that I was able to leave. I had this ability to have a passport that let me leave a war zone, but the people I was leaving behind did not have that option. And I think that's a terrible thing.
There are parallels. I mean, we're going to talk a lot about war, but there are parallels with a lot of the work that other people are doing as well. And I want to be clear about that. But Anthony, with your photography especially is very intimate. War reporting is intimate. Much of reporting is intimate. You're asking people to share stories. You're becoming a part of that story. If you're taking photographs, you're very close and immersed in that. And does that intimacy of this kind of work make people more susceptible to this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, the closer you get to trauma, essentially, the more you put yourself at risk. But to follow up on something that Janine said, I think the big challenge with her profession is just the longevity of it. You're going back so often to, the world's worst places. I think, from my perspective, what I find so interesting is not the fact that some journalists become traumatized. That's understandable. The more interesting question for me is, why are you doing it? What's motivating you to do it? What drives you to take these extraordinary risks year after year after year? Because I think if you look around at other professions, there isn't another profession that cumulatively has such an exposure to bad things. That's a really interesting question. But when you're putting yourself in the front lines like that year after year, you are exposing yourself to the kinds of stresses that can cause moral injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, depression, whatever. And that's why you see rates that are quite high. As an aside, we did a study a couple of years back comparing people who write, journalists who write about war, to those who photograph war. And our premise to begin with was that the photographers would have more symptoms because they have to be so close to what they're photographing. And in fact, we never found that. We found that the other way around, to our surprise. Our hypothesis was not upheld. And we think, when someone photographs something, there's a bit of a barrier between them and what they photograph. They're so focusing on getting the light right or framing the picture, etc., that there's an element of separation in a way between what's going on and the person. Whereas individuals writing about it don't have that level of separation. You are immersing yourself in it constantly. And so we found, to our surprise, more symptoms amongst journalists who write about trauma than those who photograph it.
It's interesting, your definition of this occurred 20 years ago, and yet this is still so incredibly new. And I can speak of this from personal experience, having recently gone through therapy for what we thought was PTSD, but which he identified as something different, but he did not know about moral injury till after we had completed our sessions, and sent me the article actually that Janine wrote, which got me interested in doing this program. But the point being that I've not done a lot of war coverage. I spent a year in South Sudan in a war zone, but I was at Columbine for a couple of weeks. I was at the Murrah Federal Office Building explosion and saw the trauma of the firemen as they went down to do their job searching for bodies. I've covered a lot of those sorts of things. And one of the points he tried to make was it's not always the severity. It doesn't have to be as severe as war coverage, dead bodies, immense trauma, but that trauma affects everybody in an individual way. And it could be something as simple as being an environmental reporter and constantly covering the trauma happening to the earth that you see, but others don't. Is that an accurate portrayal of what your work has shown?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the trauma literature, there's a debate about, is it just the severity of the trauma, or is it your perception of the trauma? In other words, people will see things differently. And there may be individuals who will perceive something as very traumatic, whereas others don't. And there's real validity to that. I mean, if you're covering difficult environmental stories and you're seeing a lot of destruction and a lot of displacement and a lot of suffering, in theory, that kind of stress could lead to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. You just have to be careful that you don't lower the bar too far, because otherwise everybody starts claiming PTSD for all sorts of minor stresses in their life. And I push back very strongly against that. I mean, I still think you've got to have a very significant stress to cause this condition. But what defines that significant stress is often going to be in the eye of the beholder. And to touch on your example, there can be some very tough environmental stories that can certainly trigger some PTSD type difficulties. I mean, the Columbine massacre, that's not a war zone, but that's a horrendous story. It's so deeply traumatic when something like that happens. And if you are on the scene and you in many ways like a first responder, and you're witnessing the distress of other people and the distress of parents who've lost children, etc., then yes, that can be something that's very difficult to deal with.
Can it be moral injury by 1,000 cuts? Can it be no huge issue, but an accumulation of smaller traumas, smaller instances?
Yes, I do believe that. I think, when you lose moral compass and somehow things that you hold dear, that to be, good things, start kind of falling away and people are behaving in morally reprehensible ways time and time again, then I think that can be very difficult to deal with, certainly. And that can undermine your faith in humanity, and that can lead to a certain cynicism. And that's, I think, a very unfortunate place to be. I think that's one of the consequences of moral injury, that people can become cynical about things, that journalists become cynical about their profession because they feel somehow, the organizations have lost a moral compass, or the people that they write about have lost their moral compass, and a deep cynicism takes root. And that's a very destructive, negative emotion to have.
I want to get to coping mechanisms, to how to identify all that, but I want to talk first about the role of, at least for those who have are not freelancers who are working for an organization. The role of organizations in responding to this, because the response was very slow, was very, very slow for many organizations. And it's only fairly recently that many national news organizations have put in place ways of helping. Does that seem a fair representation?
It does. I think, going back to, when I first met Janine in 2000, news organizations were not taking this seriously at all. But to their credit, they started to look at some of the data. Data can be very powerful. And when you're looking at, in our original study, we had a very large sample of wonderful journalists. 140 frontline journalists took part in the study. We approached 170 and 140 wanted to take part. There was an 80% acceptance rate. In the social sciences, to get that kind of acceptance rate for a study is very unusual. And what that said to me was that journalists wanted to talk about this. They wanted to share what they were feeling. And to the credit of certain news organizations, they took these data very seriously and started to change their practices. But many did not. There was a certain degree of pushback, and like everything in mental health, there's a stigma and reluctance to discuss it openly. And you're right, it's really only over the last while that this has come out the shadows, and many more news organizations are offering help. But there are still, multiple news organizations who don't take this seriously. And when you step outside our Western cultures, you come across just a desert, and nothing's being done to help journalists in so many parts of the world.
Janine, I want to talk to your experience for this in just a second, but Anthony, I want to get back to that, the idea of not just mental health systems in other countries, but health systems in general. One of the issues, I think, for journalists is that access to good health care in general is limited in many instances.
Yeah.
So
freelancers struggle, as you know. They don't have the resources. Many big news organizations have employer assistance programs. And my experience is that some journalists don't want to reach out to their EAPs. They don't trust them. They feel that they're too close to the organization. They worry about the issues of confidentiality, etc. And so they're reluctant to use employer assistance programs. And the quality of the employer assistance programs varies greatly, from being very good to frankly being very bad. And I've come across journalists who have reached out to employer assistance programs and had very bad experiences with it. And that's chased them further away from seeking help. So I think one has to be very careful about how you offer help to people and do it in a way that builds trust, and to make sure that you've got skilled therapists helping individuals, as opposed to just giving lip service to, oh, well, we have an EAP, so that's fine. We've taken care of it, because often that's not enough.
So Janine, let's talk about your experience. I think you were a freelancer for much of your time. Is that correct, or no?
Actually, I worked, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I worked for News International, the Times of London, first the Sunday Times and then the Times for 15 years. So I was with them for a long time. And when Anthony and I met right after his study was published, I think that some organizations, the AP, AFP, the BBC, did tremendous jobs at bringing in counselors for war reporters when they would come back, giving them debriefing sessions, looking after them. I have to say, in my experience, my organization did not. In fact, I think that, and it might have changed since I left in 2006, but basically we were pushed harder and harder and harder to do more and more dangerous things. There was a real culture of competition, of getting scoops. So we had to do better than the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian and the other British papers. So we had to be the first ones to get into a war zone, to a closed country, to a place that we weren't supposed to be. And at some point, after I became a mother, I realized that I was being used almost as cannon fodder. In fact, one editor said to me at one point, you're really good at getting to places that no one else can get to. And actually what he meant is you're really good at going places that no one else wants to go to. There were cases where, for instance, during the fall of Grozny, Chechnya, incredibly dangerous war, I was pushed to stay long after I had reached my cracking point. The shelling, the bombardment, the risk of kidnapping was extremely high. And my editor basically wanted me to have the front page every day and to beat The Guardian and the other papers. And we were told things, we were enticed by saying, you'll win this award, this will make your career. And at some point after doing this for decades, I finally realized that, the risk I was taking, the fact that I hadn't been injured physically, and that, luckily enough, after Anthony's study, I knew I didn't have PTSD. But certainly, looking back now, the damage that it did to my sense of my moral compass, and the things that I was forced to witness over and over and over again without them offering any kind of relief. They did make us go at some point, I think, beginning after the war after the invasion of Iraq, we had to go do hostile environment courses, which were week-long training sessions given by British Special Forces. But they only did it because it was part of our insurance packages, and we would not be covered unless we had that. And I saw colleagues of mine lose their eyes, kill themselves. Several of my friends and colleagues killed themselves, and it didn't seem to help them wake up. I still have colleagues who are still at the place where I worked, and they still tell me that they were pushed and pushed and pushed. But we were up against a very large organization, Rupert Murdoch. So there was very little we could do. And if we did, as Anthony mentioned in the beginning of this chat, the woman who came to him initially, the reporter who said, "I'm really, really suffering," and he said to her, "Have you told your boss?" And she recoiled and said, "If I told my boss, I would lose my job." And I think that's how all of us were made to feel. We were made to feel that if we said something, "I'm afraid, I don't want to go, that's too dangerous for me," or I'm really hurting after what I saw, we would basically lose our jobs, or we'd be replaced by someone else, especially the new generation of freelancers who were desperate to become war reporters because they felt it was glamorous, which it's not. And they were lining up to go to places like Syria and Libya, post-Arab Spring, with very little experience, and they were putting themselves in huge danger. So, back to your question about freelancers, I was protected to some extent. And since I did leave, after I left News International, the people I work for always, I would never go anywhere unless they gave me war insurance, unless, I had a contract. But many of my young colleagues that I mentor and try to help are sent into the field with very little protection. And this really worries me. For their physical well-being, but also their emotional well-being.
I'm sorry for the loss of your colleagues and friends. I took heat training while in South Sudan, and I'm not certain about training you've taken. There was no mental health component at all. It was simply how to respond if being attacked and trauma first aid, but no attention. This was 4 years ago, no attention paid at all to mental health. So I think that still is not caught up with a lot of that kind of training that journalists are receiving now. So they're at least getting protection on how, or training on how to stay safer while in the field from a physical standpoint, but not from a mental standpoint. So how did you cope? How did you get through that? How did you manage to function for all that time, given the lack of support from the organization you work for?
I write, and that was the thing that saved me, I think. I was able to, what I believed, and this sounds really corny, but to give a voice to people that needed that voice and who otherwise would not have been able to tell the terrible things that had happened to them. So I felt very strongly, and I think this was much more relevant in terms of the wars in the Balkans, where I think journalists really did have an effect on policy in some way, and people paid attention to us. The war in Syria was extremely frustrating for me because I felt that I was writing into a void. even if I got a front page story on the New York Times, or big op-ed pieces in the Washington Post, it still seemed as though the world had forgotten about Syria. And you know, there are many other conflicts, say the Congo, that are not reported at all. So this, you know, this is also something I think that, and you know, I'd love to hear what Anthony thinks about it, that has an effect on journalists' mental health. Because if you're living, let's say during the siege of Sarajevo, some of us lived there for years on end. And we were writing and or taking photographs or doing films and trying to have some effect, trying to end this war in a sense by painting a picture of the civilian suffering at its absolute worst. And yet nothing happened. You know, the siege went on for 1,500 days, more actually, you know, in a medieval siege. Or Aleppo, let's go back to the Syrian war, Aleppo. Those of us that were advocating and campaigning for an end to this war, for the world to wake up and see what was happening there, the terrible crimes against humanity, from hospitals being bombed to the torture cells, and yet nothing happened. And then one day in December 2016, Aleppo fell. And I remember exactly where I was and how I felt when that happened. I felt like I was a complete failure, and that all of my work, all of my notebooks lined up, you know, every conflict I covered was a waste of time. And I think that was probably the most devastating thing that that happened to me in that, you know, in that time. So yeah, how did I cope? I coped by writing, by you know, by having this, again, this, it sort of goes without saying, you know, having a strong network of support, of my own support, but it certainly did not come from News International and Rupert Murdoch.
Anthony, do you have thoughts on what she shared?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just so spot on, because we did a study of journalists working in Syria, and not surprisingly, we found, you know, a high level of trauma, but there was something that was unusual about our data. We found a very high level of depression. And when we went back to try and find out where this was coming from, there were two factors that were identified, one of which Janine has just touched on, which the sense of despondency on the part of journalists that whatever they were doing wasn't making any difference, that despite putting your life on the line and going back to the story repeatedly, it just wasn't shifting the needle. Nothing seemed to help. And that month after month after month was wearing people down. The other thing that was striking about the Syrian data was that there was no safe place for journalists. You know, even when we did a study at the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, dangerous as it was, at the end of the day, a journalist could come back to a bureau that would be guarded. If they worked for a news organization, it would be a compound. They would be able to, you know, talk to colleagues, take off their flak jacket, put up their feet, have a beer, etc. But in Syria, there was none of that respite. There was just no respite. There wasn't that kind of safe place for journalists, and that started to break people down as well, just the exhaustion of it and the relentless nature of the trauma. And when you combine that with the sense of, well, we're not making a difference, you know, our writing and our photography isn't shifting policy, it's not saving people, I think that had a very negative effect on the way journalists were feeling about themselves. And that's why we saw so much depression.
And to add another level of the lack of support from people that you're working for, as another layer of stress on top of that.
Yeah, and there was, yes, that's right. And then you know, the new threat, which really wasn't around when I first met Janine. The new threat was kidnap, and kidnap for ransom, or kidnap for execution in front of a camera, and that, you know, even ratcheted up the stress even further. So you could see so many factors coming together in one conflict, making it so difficult for journalists to work.
Right. There was a time when journalists felt at least protected from both sides from that sort of trauma, yeah. and they eventually became pawns in the war, in the way that you've described. I want to get back briefly again to employers, because there's a culpability and accountability here that I think that still does not exist. And I've talked to many people about this frustration. I've worked for a number of national networks in Washington, and only NPR sent an email at some point, and this is fairly recently, saying we have these services available, and you've described some of these and the ability to call someone and talk if you need it. But it's a step, but the step that hasn't been taken that I find frustrating is, to me, saying that, hey, a regular email going out saying we have these resources if you need them is sort of like saying to your friend who lost a spouse, call me if you need something. When someone's in a state of trauma, they're not always in a place where they can reach out. And it's my belief that the news organization should be more active in reaching out, not just putting these things in place, which is great, but to reach out more actively to make certain that this trauma is not occurring, or if it is, to offer help. Is that a reasonable position?
Yes, absolutely. I think news organizations have a moral responsibility to provide assistance. If you're going to ask people to travel to the world's most dangerous places, and that's what you're asking them to do, you have a moral responsibility to support them, to try and keep them safe physically, but also to support them psychologically. And I think one can do that. There are very clear ways of doing that, which are not intrusive, by checking in with the person on a regular basis, asking how they're feeling, by letting them know that there are supports there for them, by validating the work that they've done, by complimenting them on things that they've done, and maintaining this regular contact with the journalist in the field is essential. And then when a journalist comes back from a really difficult assignment and you have a discussion with them, you don't have to be the armchair shrink, but you can ask them, how are you? We know that this is a difficult experience. If this has affected you in any way, we do have resources for you. And just stay in touch that way by gently reminding people that this is important and we're here to support you. You can do that in a non-intrusive way, and journalists appreciate that.
And saying that we want you to stay healthy so we can keep you in the field, which goes back to the point Janine is making of feeling that if you reveal this, that you'll never work again.
It's in news organizations' best interests to have healthy journalists. I know it sounds, almost comical to say that, but absolutely, you want your employees to be healthy. You want them to be physically safe and psychologically well. It does no one a good service when you're dealing with people who are traumatized. Seen this time and time again. If you've got a journalist who's traumatized and they're working in a difficult situation, their responses will be off. They will do things that not only compromise themselves, but could compromise their colleagues. And I've seen this time and time again. You've got a bureau in a far-flung place surrounded by dangerous hostile forces, and a journalist succumbs to trauma, and that person starts behaving erratically and does things that potentially compromise the safety of the bureau. So, there's a moral responsibility to do something to help people. You can't ignore it or brush it under the carpet or say, you haven't got the right stuff. That's punitive. You don't deal with people that way.
We've got about 15 minutes left, so I want to talk about self-help. I want to talk about healing and see if there are any questions from the people watching. So can we talk a little bit about so we've defined this, we've talked about causes, because I don't know any journalist who doesn't feel passionately about their work, who doesn't feel like they're making a difference, or at least trying to make a difference. So if that is one of the standards that can affect their response to this, then that means a broad group of journalists are vulnerable. So what can they do to prepare so they can be ready for this happening, so they can identify it before it becomes too overwhelming? And then what can be done to address it?
So I think it's very important for me to state this. The majority of journalists are not traumatized. The majority of journalists do not have PTSD or moral injury. So we're talking about a minority, but it's a substantial minority. It's bigger than the percentage in the general population. I'm a big advocate for education. I mean, having sessions like this, when people are educated about psychological issues, they're better able to recognize difficulties within themselves. They can understand that there are effective therapies available. They're going to be more likely to reach out for therapy. Like anything else in medicine, if you identify a problem early on, you potentially have a better outcome when it comes to therapy. And I use physical examples. If you've got an infection, you don't wait for it to reach full-blown pneumonia before you do something about it. And it's the same with psychological difficulties. If you're aware of what they might be through education, and you recognize some of the difficulties, then you're going to be more likely to reach out for help earlier on with potentially a better outcome. Because we know from the trauma literature, if this goes unattended and people don't get therapy, it can bring someone down very hard. And it doesn't just bring down the individual, but it spills over and affects their relationships, their partner, their spouses, their children. So the individual brings home to the family their own trauma, and it can have negative consequences that spread way beyond the individual. So there are compelling reasons why you want to intervene early and identify problems quickly. Once you've done that, we know now that there are some good talk therapies for PTSD, for example. And so, you don't have to suffer. If you engage in one of these therapies, you can feel better. It can help you. And that's a message that I put across all the time. These are not untreatable conditions.
Janine, I suspect that your writing about it is one of your coping mechanisms. But how have you addressed this? How have you dealt with it?
I wanted to add something. It's related to this, that, and as I was writing the piece and talking to Anthony about it, there was one point during the siege of Sarajevo where a psychiatrist friend of mine, Bosnian, said that the entire population was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. She said that the entire population had been so traumatized that it was like a walking asylum, is how she called it. And I think that we as a global community, COVID, and in the US, what we're going through with President Trump and the elections, also, we're not in war zones, but we are in a sense, because for those of us that believe in justice, in democracy, in freedom of speech, in human rights, and we see President Trump eroding this on every level, it goes against what we believe in. So, and Anthony and I had a discussion about this, and I really want to, follow up with this in, say, a year or a year or so, to see, as a population, are we suffering from moral injury? And then the second part I wanted to say is healthcare workers. So during the COVID, the worst of it, doctors and nurses that had to make terrible decisions about who got intubated, who didn't, who they gave their full attention to, on some level must be suffering horribly from guilt and shame, all of the factors of moral injury. And just on a personal note, last week I was in the ER for something which is fine now. And all I could think of was I was in a hospital, Lenox Hill in New York, which was the epicenter of the virus. And at one point they had 300 people there. So the people taking care of me were the people that were really making huge decisions and witnessing something that went against their moral core. And I just think that we're going to see in the months, possibly the years to come, the effect of moral injury on the population because of COVID, and also different level because of President Trump and what he's doing and lying, because most of us are brought up, hopefully to believe in the truth, telling the truth, reporting the truth, speaking the truth. So to have a leader of our country who lies to us eats away at what you believe in. So I'm sorry, Dale, that wasn't exactly an answer to your question, but it was something very important that I wanted to add.
I think it's important to add because journalists are going to be covering moral injury in these groups. So not only is this about how it affects us, but also the work we'll be doing reporting on those who are also affected. So Anthony, your response to that?
Yeah, look, there's so much that you covered with that, Janine. I think just touching on the COVID pandemic, because it's so prevalent and it's kind of strangling the world. I was approached at the beginning of the pandemic by the Reuters Institute of Journalism at Oxford to help with a study looking at how journalists were dealing with the pandemic. And we've just finished the study. And what's really interesting is this: over 50% of the journalists made use of therapy, psychological therapy, once the pandemic had started. And so that's encouraging. Those journalists who took advantage of therapy were showing a lot less symptoms than those who didn't. And so we have here in real time evidence that therapy makes a difference. The journalists who were receiving this kind of help were reporting less anxiety, less depression, less PTSD type difficulties compared to their colleagues who were either not offered the therapy or didn't accept it, or for whatever reason, never got it. So that's an interesting observation. The broader question of moral injury in society at large, I think, is a fascinating one. Obviously, it's going to be determined by one's political persuasion, because I'm sure that President Trump supporters don't have one glimmer of moral injury. But if you're on the other side of the political spectrum and you're seeing what you view as this morally egregious behavior and repetitive lying, that's very distressing. Absolutely. I mean, you come back to the definition of moral injury, that it's a damage done to one's moral compass by witnessing behavior that you feel transgresses one's moral code of ethics. And that's it. I mean, the definition says it all. This is what you're seeing time and time again from the most powerful man in the land, the man who's supposed to set the moral tone of how we lead our lives to some degree. That's what Roosevelt believed, by the way. You're seeing things that are deeply distressing on a daily basis. And then it permeates down. Other people are empowered by that and start doing the same thing. Whether it's in the Justice Department or environmental, the sciences, everything becomes contaminated by this moral malaise. And that's what's so distressing. And we know that the emotions that are associated with moral injury are shame and guilt. And when I speak to my colleagues in the United States, I have many wonderful colleagues in the United States. We collaborate on so many projects. They tell me right now, for the very first time, they feel ashamed about what's going on in their country. And I've never heard that before from Americans. They give open voice. We feel ashamed by this. And that's, that is moral injury to a degree. I mean, the other factors as well, but that's part of being, having sustained a moral injury.
So Janine, one last question, and we'll see if anybody in the audience has a question. But this idea of objectivity in journalism, that is often considered or called the view from nowhere, this sort of arm's length separate way that many journalists approach writing their stories. Does the way we cover stories create a situation that makes moral injury more likely to occur? Is there a different way we could do our writing, one that perhaps is more nuanced, more complex, more human, that might reduce that level of moral injury?
Very hard if you're a field worker. I think it's fine if you're sitting at a desk and writing about diplomacy or writing about the UN or writing even, about the elections from a distance. If you are in the field, if you're in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or you're in California witnessing the fires, or Oregon, or you're in South Sudan, or you're in Rwanda witnessing a genocide, unless you're made of stone, I think it is extremely difficult. And most of my colleagues, or the colleagues I respect and I'm close to, we cared deeply, deeply about the countries and the conflicts we were involved in. It wasn't just a story. Nothing has ever for me been just a story. I tend to go places and spend a long time. I get very deep. I embed, but not with US troops the way journalists did during the Iraq War, more with local communities. So it's for me anyway, the kind of person, the way I'm built, absolutely impossible for me not to get involved in some way. And perhaps I'm not really a journalist anymore. Maybe I'm much more of an advocate or an activist, a human rights advocate, a human rights defender. But that is what I do. And, I have been in situations with colleagues, for instance, the war in Sarajevo. And I think there was a photograph in Harper's that showed this. The war in Sarajevo, there were many civilians that were killed and injured by mortar shells in front of us. So it became really common practice for journalists, if you were somewhere and there was a shelling, that you would help take the wounded to the hospital. Now, it's interesting because the lines were very blurred between, especially in Sarajevo, because we were living in the besieged city. We were being attacked as well as the people around us. So the lines were very blurred. And at some point, one of my dear friends who went on to work for Human Rights Watch, running the Africa division, said to me, "You're not a social worker, you're a journalist." But I didn't see myself as a social worker, but I saw myself as a human being. And if someone came to me looking for help, I would try to give them that in the best of my ability. Sometimes it was overwhelming. Sometimes there were dozens of people who needed to get out of the city, who needed money, who needed firewood, who needed food, who needed help for their injured children. And I was spending more time doing that than I was actually on my reporting. But I regret nothing. I mean, that was all what I saw as the least I could do to help these people who were having immense suffering. And in a sense, it was good for me because it made me feel that I needn't feel ashamed or guilty because I had done my absolute best. And as a human being, not as a journalist, as a human being. And that, I think, is probably why. I mean, I haven't discussed with Anthony if I have moral injury. I did take part in his recent study, but I don't know if the results are up yet. I know I do on some level, but I also think I've been able to live with it, to cope with it, to accept it, because I know in my heart of hearts that over the 30 years I've worked, there's a lot of people out there that I've gotten out of the country they're in, that I've helped educate, that I've tried to set them on career paths, and it's small, but isn't there a line from the Torah that says, if you can save one life, you save humanity? And often, we can't save a country, but we can save a few people. And that's the kind of mantra that I've always lived with.
You raise a point here that I think cuts at the core of the debate over what journalism is. And it's interesting to hear you say, I believe in human rights, so I'm an advocate, or someone saying that to you. Environmental journalists hear this all the time. You believe in clean air and clean water, so you're an advocate, you're not a journalist. And I'm always puzzled by this. I mean, there are some basic things that I think we can all agree are important as human beings. Human rights is probably a pretty significant one up there. Clean environment is in my mind a very important thing. When I've been told this, that I'm an advocate, my response is, okay, which don't you want? Clean air, clean water. Well, okay, then you're an advocate. It's to me a very specious argument, but this cuts at the core of what journalism is about.
But I don't mind what I'm called. I mean, I'm a writer and I'm a truth teller, and I'm someone that's bringing a story and bringing voices of people to an audience. I don't care if you call me a journalist or a human rights defender or an activist or a professor at Yale. I mean, I resist being labeled something. As for journalism, I mean, that's a whole other webinar, but I believe that what journalism is now is not what it was, certainly when I started. We have, extremely polarized views. Some of them even, I am an old-fashioned liberal, but I would be called here extreme left, and I'm not by any means. I'm center left, but, even the left-wing press, I think, has gotten, we're no longer balanced. We've got the right, we've got the left, and there's very little in between giving people the truth or even options. So I think that, journalism as it stands now is a very different thing. But I do think that, if you go into the field, and we're talking about people that are working in the field, environmental workers that are looking at Lake Chad shrinking and how it's affecting the livelihood of fishermen along Lake Chad. I think we have to bring passion and our own voice to it to kind of amplify it. And of course, human rights are fundamental things. Everyone has the right to clean water, the right to education, the right to a livelihood. But the world we're living in now, and with the erosion of democracy around the world, is increasingly not that place. So as journalists, all we can really do is write the truth. And yes, okay, we're supposed to be objective, but sometimes objectivity, a friend of mine once said, the truth isn't always objective. Sometimes you have to take a side. And, we're living in times right now that absolutely are examples of that.
it looks like we have a lot to think about. All right. Well, so let me thank all of you for joining us today. Janine, especially. It's always difficult to share emotionally some of these effects, and I'm grateful for all that you've been able to offer, and Anthony as well for the knowledge that you bring to this. A quick process note for journalists: a video of this webinar will be posted in the next few days at the Earth Institute blog called State of the Planet. The address is blogs.ei.columbia.edu. Along with the video, I'll include a blog post. There will be links to resources, along with information you can use to expand your understanding of moral injury. I hope you'll check that out and also look at the other videos that make up the Resilience Media Project. The Resilience Media Project is a part of Andy Revkin's new initiative at the Earth Institute called Sustain What. Sustain What is a global conversation focused on identifying concrete solutions to the complicated challenges of humanity today. Our primary focus is on making sense of the changes impacting our Earth and biological systems. In light of the outbreak of COVID-19, the main focus of our sessions is on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by the pandemic, and teaching journalists how to better respond to these issues. At the same time, we're also focusing on ways to build more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable communities in the years ahead. You can check out Andy's program as well as mine at the Earth Institute website. Also, a reminder for SEJ members of the DART Center University of Tulsa Survey and Trauma. Your response will help DART and SEJ plan future programming to support environmental journalists' mental health needs. Again, my thanks to our guests and to you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again at a future program. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.